Okay, let's start in with Malthusianism and the concept of overpopulation. And obviously, just like Keynesianism came from John Maynard Keynes, this thing called Malthusianism came from Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was a Unitarian minister, as I recall. And his name is synonymous with something called overpopulation. So why are we talking about overpopulation when we're talking about classical long-run economic growth? Well, the reason is because if we have a nation, we talk about how wealthy our nation is by the size of our GDP, gross domestic product. How much stuff did we produce in our nation? If our nation was very productive, we produced a big, big mound of stuff. Pretty wealthy. Some other nation over here, well, they're not as wealthy because they can only produce a little bunch of stuff. That's one measure. But another measure is, well, but how much did that nation produce in comparison to how many consumers they got? Reminds me of some bank robbers. They pull a heist. Well, they knocked off a bank for $100,000. Oh, that's a lot of money. But what if instead of 2 of them, there were 10 of them? If there are only 2 of them, they get $50,000 each. But if there's 10 of them, they only get 10,000 each. So it's not just how big is the size of the pie, but how many people are biting into that pie. How many slices do you got to slice that pie up? And that's GDP per capita. If we take the GDP of the nation and we divide it by the population, now we have a somewhat better illustration or number for how prosperous that nation is when we say, well, how much wealth is there in comparison to the number of people in that country? You could talk about a small country like Liechtenstein. I think that's it. Liechtenstein? I think that's right. In the middle of Europe, where it's just a tiny little thing. I mean, I suppose it's not much bigger than the city of Mansfield or something from what I know about it, but it has a very, very high standard of living. I mean, the people there are quite wealthy in terms of GDP per capita. But in terms of the total GDP, it's practically nothing compared to a larger nation like Canada, United States, Mexico, Germany, etc. So when we're talking about economic wealth and we say GDP per capita, now why did they say GDP per capita rather than GDP per person? I don't know, but I think capita is probably Latin. It comes from capital. A capital letters are bigger, but a column with a big flowery archy thing over the top, those are called the capitals on top of a column. And so capita, that thing sitting on top of your shoulders, is your capital, I guess. And so if you're decapitated, then I think we've been lost our head because we've been decapitated and we're no longer a capital type person. So we talk about how much stuff was produced per person or per capita. Now obviously one way of increasing our GDP per capita is to get this guy going, is to get our output up, bring up our output. That will increase our GDP per capita. Obviously, another way we could increase our GDP per capita is to decrease this guy. When we have a government policy to decrease this number here, are you catching where, let's call this one 10 on top, and we'll say that this is 5 on the bottom. So our GDP capita would be 2. But if we can't get this GDP to go up, well, why don't we just kind of lower our population down to 2? And this number would go up to 5. So we could increase our GDP per capita just by decreasing the number of people in that nation. Now, you're probably aware of the Chinese one-child policy, and they were trying to do that. Not only just grow this, and this has been growing tremendously for the Chinese, and so I don't think there's as much push on this as there was, but I think it's probably still there. not too many years ago, we were host to a Chinese couple that the the wife was getting her MBA at Ashland University, and her husband was kind of like a teenage idol or something like that, and he was a very, very accomplished musician. And she really wanted to get her advanced business degree, because if she had her advanced business degree, then she would be allowed to have a larger family, and having a large family was really important to them, and so they really wanted to do that. Um, American Idol would be about like the equivalent of American Idol. That's what he was. So that's why I know that there's still some emphasis that, at least at that point in time. So now, when we talk about increasing this, yeah, that's standard stuff. But what about this guy? What about government policy to guide or control population in order to reach a GDP per capita goal, in order to achieve a macroeconomic wealth goal, national wealth goal? Sound reasonable? Doesn't sound reasonable? It sounds like you don't like the sound of that? Some people just don't like the government in their bedroom. Is that kind of what you're thinking, or something like that? Actually, the Supreme Court judges who ruled in Roe v. Wade, you remember that one? Not to get too controversial. That particular one, I remember hearing the arguments. I actually got a video or an audio and listened to the closing arguments. I go, wow, that's not too convincing, but the judges ruled that way. They found a human right in the penumbra of the Constitution in their abortion ruling. And the penumbra is a fancy way of saying we found it between the lines in order to justify their decision. It's not really there explicitly, but it's there between the lines, and so they found it in the penumbra of the Constitution. Well, why did they rule on that? That has been a very, very divisive and controversial issue to this very day. This is still being fought out in a court of public opinion, and emotions still run high on both sides of this issue. And I forget the name of the Supreme Court judge who said it, said, man, if we knew what we know now about getting involved in human engineering, we never would have opened that can of worms. But what they really thought that they were doing was they thought they were involved in helping the economy by using the birth control method that's almost guaranteed to work. Not postponing marriages till you get older. Abortion does do this decrease in capital idea, and they felt that they were involved in saving our society economically. Now, I guess I have to give you a little bit more illustration of that. From my high school biology class, I remember very, very well, where you get to that portion in biology class where they begin to talk about the birds and bees and flowers and trees and all those sorts of things, and how the mechanics of the human reproductive system works and all that sort of stuff. And this is a long time ago, but I do remember that there was an illustration in a magazine called Time magazine, and there was this globe here, like this, and in the United States and South America, you see these people just side by side, just stacked in there like sardines, just no place to move. And there's this little fuse coming out here, and it's kind of burning fuse here. And in this particular article, the subcaption was the population time bomb. That was the subtitle of this particular Time magazine. The population time bomb. Now, I remember that high school class because I came from a family of 6 kids. Of course, I had 9, but the family with 6 kids, and we thought that was a big family at that point in time. And I remember the lesson, and we were hearing about the danger of the human species being its own worst enemy of multiplying like rabbits and consuming all the resources of the world, and pretty soon we're all going to die because of our own sexual reproductive system. And impressionable youth that I was, thinking that that's kind of economically, biological irresponsible, that I went home and said something along the lines that I didn't think that Mom and Dad were very socially responsible for having so many kids. Now, I was just speaking my mind, it's First Amendment right, free speech, but I don't think I had any dinner that night. I don't recall any dinner. Something along the lines, well, we could probably get rid of you first, or something along those lines. But the conversation didn't go well. That's all I remember. The conversation did not go well at all. And I kind of just forgot that subject and just went on about my life and didn't worry about the population time bomb. But not just China. This was a matter of national security for the United States as well at that time, that they were very, very concerned about population. A number of studies, the one most controversial one that's really controversial is a study from Iron Mountain, something like that, where they talked about this concept of overpopulation. Now, we do not hear that term very often today. At least I don't hear it as much. But I remember it from this time period that overpopulation was a very big deal. And now I think that with that background, you can kind of understand the sort of political pressures that were behind the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court case during that particular point in time. And it has to do with economics. I'm trying to point out that a lot of these things socially have to do with economics and macroeconomics in particular. Okay, how do I want to wrap this up? Malthus said, that's where I want to go. Malthus, and they called him, his students, he was a professor at one point in his life, they called him Pop Malthus. They call him Pop Malthus for population Malthus. Anyway, that's why they call him Pop Malthus. So if we've got time on this axis here, and we've got whole population on this axis, Malthus was saying two things: that increases in productivity tend to be linear because a farmer can only feed so many people. And yes, they can get incrementally better, and of course, he never saw the fantastic things that modern farmers can do with their big 8-wheel tractors and all that sort of stuff. But Malthus says that technology increases linearly, like 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, etc. That'd be a linear progression. But population increases exponentially. Not linearly, exponentially. And an exponential curve kind of looks like a hockey stick, that it starts low and then it begins to take off at a maddening pace. So it also increases like 2, 4, and then it goes 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. So you see that this curve begins to go up dramatically, where technology tends to increase linearly, and there is a point here that there is going to be a collision course, and pretty soon there is going to be many mouths to feed that can't be fed, and that is irresponsible and irrational for us human beings to see this coming and not get out of the way of that freight train. In this area that we live in, they have a hunting season, and it's open season on deer, bambies and bucks and does and stuff. And if they do not call the herd, well, then they know that there's going to be a whole lot more fender benders, because you start whacking into those things and people get hurt, and a lot of damage, and so they've got to cull the herd. That's one reason. If they don't cull the herd, not only do you have a bunch of fender benders, but all of a sudden the deer population gets so big, the farmers take all their crops off the field. When they take all the crops off the field, then all of a sudden their food supply is gone. And the only thing they've got left going into the winter is the bottom of the trees. And if you go into Mohican State Park there in some areas, it just looks like there's a canopy, just like there's a roof underneath the trees. It's just, have you been there? It's just, you go up so far and it's just flat. It's just totally flat. You go, how did these trees just come? And then you realize, oh. The deers got hungry, and that's how much they could eat, and that's how much they could reach. And so they eat it off all the stuff. Now, if you've got a massive big herd of deer, and that's the only thing they have to eat to get through the summer, you're going to have a mass die-off. They're just going to die in the droves because that's a whole lot more deer population than the agriculture can sustain. And so in order to protect the deer from dying out and killing the whole species, you got to cull the herd. Now, I don't want to be crass here and say you got to cull the herd of humanity, but kind of that idea is that we've got to do something rational about this human sexual reproduction of things that's going to cause havoc and going to be a national security issue to our country. So Malthus said that, again, population is an exponential curve where technological growth is a linear curve, and where this going to finally meet, then we're in for big trouble, just like if we don't cull the herd of deer. We're going to stop there and pick up on this in the next session.